Right. So America kind of tends to, again, focus on pregnancy more like an illness. Lots of doctors involved, treat you more like you um, need care. You don't know what you're doing. They do. Kind of that division of labor piece. In the Netherlands and the Yucatan, it's more natural. They tend to do things more at home with family, and it's just like, especially in the Yucatan, it's a natural process that maybe they see as some people like the Netherlands or Sweden see as a beautiful thing that you're supposed to kind of go through, and the Yucatan is similar. That it's just like a process that you go through, whereas America also tends to be a little bit more finicky around things like pain and medication in terms of medicating for pain. So some interesting cross cultural stuff around pregnancy. Um, in terms of childhood, um, once we get into childhood adaptation, there's a lot of things that happen with different culture groups. Child labor is something. There's a whole book around anthropology of childhood, and it's called Anthropology of Childhood: Cherubs, Chattel, and Changelings. You need to know the different terms. Cherubs are basically kind of what people would say exist in um, Western society, um, in terms of well-to-do, well-off children, as in they're cherubs, they can do no wrong. Um, they're angelic, those kinds of things. Chattel is more of like children as labor, as cattle, slavery, which also happens in developing countries. It doesn't tend to happen in already developed because we tend to create laws around that. And it also doesn't happen around hunting and gathering as well. It tends to happen in industrializing places. Other cultures just view children as changelings. And I would say that this is more kind of at the pragmatic level of hunter gatherers, that children are going to learn through laugh and fun and play, but they're also going to imitate their parents and work, but they're changing. Globalization's impact on childhood and societies. Again, this becomes an interesting one with industrialization. A lot of times, as cities industrialize, people move kind of to the outskirts. Both parents end up working, so no one's taking care of the kids. The kids either work themselves to support their families, or they end up joining like street gangs, or they end up kind of bonding with each other. They end up being captured and sold off as child slavery. So they end up trusting other children more than they do adults, and then children are raising them and teaching them how the world is, even though they're children and they don't actually know kind of the ways of the world. So some interesting things around industrialization. Children used to, in terms of hunting gathering times, they had a very unique place where they could play and work, and were viewed as vital, but not as vital as the elders. And we'll talk about the difference between gerontocracy and neontocracy in a second. Um, yeah, so really a lot of interesting, like kind of depressing things happen around development and industrialization. We had the same thing in the Americas in the 1880s. There were street kids running around, orphans. All of this stuff starts to pick up around this time period, and really they were child labor, and then we passed child labor laws. So there's a lot. It looks like almost a universal that this is a growing pain of industrialization and kind of global capitalism. Um, Childhood conundrum. Again, this is the privileged children. Um, we talk about kind of overproduction and indulgence. So we whisk them off to soccer practice, and then we take them to something else. I know my nephew is involved in probably 7 different sports throughout the year, and he's 8. I played baseball, and I had to beg my parents, probably because I was used as child labor on the farm. But that's all right, right? Like for me, that was a great experience. However, I can kind of relate to these different versions of kind of childhood kind of conundrums or whatnot. Child marketplace and consumer products. The fascinating one here is that you have poor child kind of labor and slavery in Pakistan and India making soccer balls in a factory at the age of 5. That then is just going to be sold to our 5-year-olds over here to play in a game and have fun and kind of indulge them in these different games. So there's these two children, two different parts of the world operating in very different ways. Um, we get into malnourishment and children also, I use the soccer ball analogy, but chocolate is also kind of an interesting one where slave children are processing chocolate for overweight children in the West. Um, so in Pakistan, the labor pool is a lot of it is excess kids. There's a lot of children, so they use that as part of the labor pool. In Tanzania, there's 300,000 street children. That's a big number. Marginalized children, overpopulation in rural areas. Um, in many countries, more children, the better. It has nothing to do with resources, but is a kind of a God-given fortune. So this is one of those pieces where, in some countries, uh, again, agriculture, right? There has been a spiritual or idealistic ideology component put on top of that, which is that the more children you have, the more that kind of God loves you. Um, Multiple parenthoods, elective families. You have different kinds of parents now. Like even in America, you have grandparents as parents. So this is kind of an interesting one. Street children, talked about this one already. Some individuals have lack of access to birth control. The fascinating one here is that hunter and gathering people knew about herbs and birth control. We've lost that ability, so now there's a dependence on the state in terms of medicine. Um, there's ideology, religious issues with overpopulation. Too many mouths to feed basically equals alcoholism and abuse of women and children. This is kind of also in this industrialized time period. Street children end up getting branded as witches that then cast them out, and their parents basically say, "Oh, you're misbehaved and you're a witch. You've got to go." So then they're street children. Um, Anthropologists have a hard time studying children and families, especially in pain. Um, and this gets into some of the ethical kind of behaviors. Do you insert yourself into a group that is kind of going through this torment and pain and these issues? And then how do you feel about yourself? How do you report it? These are the conundrums of anthropology, especially in these developing nations. Um, Street culture, a little bit more on that. Overpopulation, economic stagnation, basically drives people into the cities to sell products. This would be a picture of kind of what is represented there. Um, Field work of street children. There is being field work done where anthropologists are studying the street gangs and the street children kind of phenomenon. Subsistence is the goal, right? Surviving. But they become vendors. They make friends with restaurant employees. They beg. They do sexual favors. Anything to survive. Enculturation practices in the street. So they learn their culture and their society from street people who already have a negative kind of view of society. And why wouldn't they? Because they're kind of cast out. Leadership falls on usually the oldest adolescent in the group. And then I put plasticity of children and threats here. Is the issue is that children are very plastic in terms of not plastic, but they have a plasticity to them in that they don't know the world yet, so they haven't really formed. So even like people moving them into slavery or these other things, they just kind of, this is my lot, and they move through these kind of mental stages with this kind of plasticity kind of in a way. Um, Threats, obviously threats are things like in India and Pakistan being taken by an adult, rounded up and moved into slave labor. That would be a threat. Losing your parents to work, or just losing them in a factory. I mean, there's a lot going on here. Children's agency. So this is when we get into the very different kind of focal points. And agency versus lack of agency tends to be a very big conversation when we talk about children. How free are you? Remember, every culture is gonna kind of manage this in a different way. Hunter gatherers, children were fine to play. Um, However, they were encouraged also to help do work and pick berries and gather and stuff like that. But it wasn't like a, you know what, you must do this. They tend to have more agency in that situation. And what's interesting is that we tend to in the West, we tend to give children agency by asking them things like, "Hey, so what sports do you want to play? Do you want to play football?" So now we've launched into the power of suggestion, and kids usually say yes. Well, once they do, now we've kind of taken that time component of agency away from them, and now we've launched them into football and soccer and all these other things. And I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but when we really look at agency and time, these are kind of the topics. Voice, basically. You will go to school at age 5. This is required. You will go to work. You will do this. This is kind of, and children in general do not have a loud voice in society. They're not represented politically. If they do have a voice in the West, it's probably because they're a celebrity, right? They don't really have power over the status. in this. But really, what I wanted to get down to on this slide is that the difference between neontocracy and gerontocracy. Neontocracy is basically that kids rule, um, and we honor them. So in today's kind of Western culture, especially in America, kids are making decisions about where they eat dinner, what they eat for dinner, what shows they watch. They are making a lot more decisions. So they tend to have agency around materialistic ideas and stuff. But they also run the roost. We tend to focus on children, the future, as being the most important component of our society. They have no status, they have no political voice, but we view them as being the most important. A gerontocracy is a flip side of that, which is what we used to have in America, where kids are the lowest members of society and elders are the highest. Now, I've seen this happen in my own kind of life, and my grandparents are the perfect example of it. My grandparents grew up, obviously, in a gerontocracy age where elders were revered. You took care of your parents when they got old, like my grandparents took care of my great grandmother until she died at 102. But my grandparents are the perfect in between zone where they saved up enough money so that they could put themselves into a home so that my mom and her sisters would not have to take care of my grandparents. This is a move towards neontocracy. We don't want to burden you with the elders. So they're going to go into another place, and it's all about youth, and it's about kids ultimately. But youth is prized, and elders are not. So that's the big difference. In East Asian cultures, elders are still prized. They know the most, they have the most money, they run the country, and they are revered and they're respected. This is very different in our culture, and we've made a switch in the last kind of 60 years, to be honest. Children as commodities, again, this goes back to kind of slavery and or work that they do. Overprotection, loss of free time with Western children. I touched on this before, putting them in every little thing that we can, keeping children happy. There's this kind of phenomenon of what they call little emperors in China. Remember, under the one policy program, they tended on focusing on having boys. So there's this kind of little emperor idea as well, and it's growing in terms of when they become middle class, they tend to move away towards gerontocracy and move towards neontocracy. I see China kind of moving in this direction as well, like we did. There's some interesting things that we do culturally, like come up with things like the boogeyman. In Hispanic cultures, they have La Llorona and Cucuy to basically scare kids from venturing too far off. We've always had these things. We used them as taboo stories in hunter-gatherer times as well. But we use a lot of them to eliminate kind of children doing things from actually telling them that they shouldn't actually fear things, or that maybe they should have a real fear. We kind of use this fake or mythical kind of storytelling so that we don't actually have to do any real explanation to children. So it's kind of interesting as well. Protecting self-esteem goes along with the deontocracy too. Don't tell them no. Being a teacher and kind of educated in this program is interesting, right? Like, no is not necessarily a right answer. You have to say, oh, well, thank you for sharing. And then anyway, this is something that has changed obviously in our culture as well. Drop in national park attendance correlates directly with video game usage. So what we've seen is video game usage goes up, drop in national park attendance, and a lot of that has to do with kids also making decisions on what they do. They're playing video games instead of going to the national park. We don't protect them from consumerism. In the 1960s and 70s, this really took off, and now companies just focus on kids because they know if I put the bubblegum and stuff at the end of the checkout, there's going to be enough children telling their mom that they want bubblegum to buy the bubblegum and pull it off the rack, and sales are going to be huge. And this is all happening around this time period, and kids kind of having more control over this process. I talked about the soccer balls already. Rites of passage. I've discussed rites of passage extensively. Again, part of it is development of self. George Herbert Mead wrote Mind, Self, and Society. This is that other people must view me as a self, and then I view them viewing me as a self in order to become a self. And again, this is kind of observing others and cultural viewing. Cross-cultural views and constructs of identity. Identity and self are cultural constructs. Some cultures, it's more about the collective. Our culture is more about the individual. Talked about gerontocracy, youth, change around the world, cog in the wheel. Talked about these two. All right. So ultimately, that is the week's lesson. I told you guys I was going to try to cut it. It's 45 minutes instead of the usual hour plus. Remember, neontocracy, gerontocracy. Neontocracy, youth is idolized or prized. Gerontocracy, elders are prized.